Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the last day of this year's ELB. So thank you to everyone in the audience, and especially thank you for coming, Tara June Winch. Tara June Winch is an Aboriginal Australian writer based in France. In 2006, her first novel, Swallow the Air, was published and critically acclaimed, repeatedly rewarded. 2 years later, she was mentored by Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, and in 2016, the story collection After the Carnage came out. And now, the book she brought with her today, The Yield, for which she won this year's Miles Franklin Award. And she just initiated the Share the Mic Now Australia campaign, which amplifies Indigenous voices. Welcome to this year's ELB, Tara June Winch.
Danke, thank you.
My name is Charlotte Milsch. As you can see, I will be moderating this event tonight. A short note before we start. This event takes place as part of the cluster Temporal Communities of the Freie University Berlin. They planned an event series called Indigenous Voices, which had to be postponed to next year due to COVID. But tonight's event will give you a little taste of what's to come next year. The Yield, a novel with a title difficult to translate into German or maybe any other language. While reading, I always thought about how the German translation might sound, and I hope we won't have to wait too long, because there's a unique musicality in your writing, a musicality that leaves us floating through the book and experiencing a new language and culture and tradition through this language and vice versa. It's a book about Wiradjuri culture and language. It's a book about colonization, about shame and grief. It's about reclaiming power, reclaiming your voice, and about healing as well. So we have a lot to talk about. And Tara will read one part of the novel as well, of course. After the event, you have the chance to get the book yourself, and Tara is so nice to sign it for you outside. So I'm very happy that you're here, and it's your first time in Berlin, and maybe your first travel since the epidemic, I don't know. How were the last weeks and months for you, especially as a writer?
Right. I think at the beginning of this coronavirus experience, there was, I think it came in stages for everyone. There was the fear and confusion at the beginning, and then there was a sort of camaraderie, especially with the singing that we saw on the balconies in Italy, the clapping for health workers in the UK, and there was, as you said before, everyone baking banana bread and cakes at home. And I think for artists and writers, there was a sort of promise to a sense that we would spend the time, this sort of global isolation, working on our creative works, working on our artistic endeavors, and really utilizing that time. But like so many friends of mine, artists and writers, it became more, as that monotony and the pressure kind of set in, especially having your physical spaces invaded by family. I think it just became, every day became instead a survivalist type instinct from day to day. So in terms of creativity, it's been really difficult. I've been fortunate to sort of reach out to another significant writer and journalist who was grappling with the same kind of creative, almost draining of creativity. And we formed a sort of creative companionship where we've pushed each other to write these long, winding letters in order to keep that creativity, in order to keep that inquiry into nostalgia and and it was kind of an unspoken rule not to talk about politics and not to talk about a pandemic at all. So that's been really important for me too, and for my other artist friend to stay in touch with that creative essence. Yeah, that was a really long answer. Sorry, Charlotte.
I read that your novel came a pretty long way, that you started it while writing your first novel, Swallow the Air, in 2004 and 2005. How were the beginnings of the Yield, and can you describe the writing journey for us?
Right. So in 2004, 2005, I was, first of all, I should say I'm a Wiradjuri descendant. My father he's a Wiradjuri man from Nuremberg, from country, and he was removed from his mother at 3 years old into a boys' home, a state-sanctioned boys' home, where he was removed from his language and culture. So that was always, although we grew up in a proud Aboriginal family, that was always sort of a historical weight that hung on us, and with it a sort of sense of shame for my father having been an Indigenous man and a dark-skinned Indigenous man, unlike myself, and having to exist in a society where the outside information was constantly telling him that he was this, and the prejudice that came with that, the racism, and yet he had none of his cultural links, and particularly none of his language. So back in 2004, 2005, I was researching my first novel, which came out in 2006, and I was heading back to his ancestral country to meet relatives I'd never met before, to see the boys' home and other children's home in this area, and to understand the geography of this place and explore that broken cultural link that was a sort of national shame and a sort of national amnesia that these things happened on this country. And during that research process, I stumbled upon a language class in my father's Indigenous language, which is Wiradjuri. And it was only a 30-minute class, and it was purely an accidental, serendipitous event. And it was such a healing balm for me personally to roll that language on my tongue. It was such a link to the past that in my first book I incorporated some of this language into the narrative. But as with every writer who brings out a novel, I think, the first emotion is regret that you didn't, explore a character enough or didn't edit one page, and my regret was that I didn't really show the significance of language within that culture. And so it was a promise in 2006 until 2019 when it came out. So it just carried that momentum of language really as an entry point into a culture, and also an archive, an actual library of all time. So during my mentorship with Wole Soyinka, living in Nigeria, I carried this novel as well. And I think he really pointed out how overly ambitious I was trying to be. I was trying to tell this story of language on one hand that I hadn't studied linguists, I had no real idea, but I just knew it was an instinctual feeling of this, that I couldn't let it go, and emotional. And I was also trying to tell the story of the whole country. I was focusing, he said, too largely on the sociological condition of a nation. And so part of that mentorship was basically to have me focus on to keep going small, he said. And so when I went geographically small. When I pushed the novel onto 500 acres of land that was a metaphor for the whole country, then I would be limited to how many characters I could have within that 500 acres and focus on, because I'm covering all time in this novel, and focus on how then to tell this great timeline, especially in church time, which is, I say church time as it's a sort of chronological set of time, and then also Aboriginal time in the dreaming, which is the concept of having the past and the future all existing in the present. So this also is sort of cyclical idea of time too. So yeah, that's how the novel came to be in a way, and that's how I was able to finish it. Yeah, really from Wally saying pull it in, pull it in, pull it in constantly.
There are three main characters in the book, three voices in different time periods who get to tell the story. There's August Gondiwindi, the contemporary storyline. She returns from Europe to Australia because of the funeral of her grandfather. There's the Lutheran missionary, Reverend Greenleaf, a German, who writes a letter in 1915, and of course there's the story of Poppy, August's grandfather, who works on a dictionary of the Wiradjuri language. And that's a project he's very passionate about, and this dictionary, we hear personal stories, we hear quotes from the Bible, we hear about ancestral connection. Why does he feel, what is his, why are words so important for him? And why does he feel the urge to create this dictionary?
Right. So at the beginning, I'll read a little bit from Poppy to get a feel for how it is that a dictionary is, basically that the narrative is written in a dictionary format and why it was necessary, I felt. I think Poppy and his dictionary are kind of the heart of the book. And the book, I've said this before, there's no elevator pitch for this book because it just seems so, when you try to explain it, it seems complex and overwhelming. So I apologize in advance. His act of, he knows he's about to die. He wants to, as we all do, leave a mark on the earth where we've been. And his way of doing that, with this, new wave of impending environmental violence and the threat of his people being removed from the land and the land of significance being removed from the nation, in a sense, in a physical sense, he wants to leave, his intention is to leave a handbook, in a sense, as is the dictionary of language, but it's working on multiple levels. It's telling the story of his boyhood, growing up on a mission or being born on the flats of the river, and you can see the political impact on Indigenous people through his timeline, being sort of brushed off to different agencies and protective bodies. So he's telling this personal story of boyhood, and it's quite playful. He's telling but he's also presenting a tool, a weapon through language that can be used by his family to protect the land and to protect their union, which is fighting for native title. In Australia, sovereignty was never ceded. Australia was invaded, and native title is the truth over the declaration of terra nullius, that there was an empty land in the colonisation of Australia. So to prove an ownership of land in many colonised nations, but particularly in Australia, there needs to be proof of a civilization. And so he's trying to prove his not just the humanity of his people through language, but that they were an actual civilization. And so there's 4 indicators of a civilization. There must be house building, dwelling. There must be a domestication of animals, agricultural activity, and reverence for the dead. And so slowly, Poppy is telling these stories of how plants were used, how there was agricultural activity in the native grasses and the native carrot and the murnong. So through language, he can tell the Indigenous civilization. There was house building, there were, and we have evidence in I lose my English because I live in France, the ethnological items of a civilization. You've probably seen these round, long dishes, Indigenous dishes with patterns and paintings on one side. They're kind of curved, and they were used to carry fish from different water bodies. They were farming fish in Wiradjuri country. So, and slowly through the book, he's revealing this. So he's leaving a couple of handbooks, in a sense, a dictionary and a tool, a weapon to prove native title against the impending mine and the government approval of a mine on their ancestral land.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, you did. Maybe it's a good time to read.
Yeah, okay. So the book opens with Poppy, who I've just talked about. I was born on Nurembang. Can you hear it? Nurembang. If you say it right, it hits the back of your mouth, and you should taste blood in your words. Every person around should learn the word for country in the old language, the first language, because that is the way to time travel. You can go all the way back. My daddy was Buddy Gondiwindi, and he died a young man by the hands of a bygone disease. My mother was Augustine, and she died an old woman by the grip of, well, it was an old world disease too. Yet nothing ever really dies. Instead, it all goes beneath your feet, beside you, part of you. Look there, grass on the side of the road, tree bending in the wind, fish in the river, fish on your plate, fish feeding you. Nothing is ever gone. Soon, when I change, I won't be dead. I always memorized John 11:26. Whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Yet life rushed through and past me as it will for each person. Before I believed everything they taught me, I thought when all were dead that all were gone. And so, as a young fella, I tried to find my place in this short life. I only wanted to decide for myself how I'd live it, but that was a big ask in a country that had a plan for me, already mapped in my veins since before I was born. The one thing I thought I could control was my own head. It seemed the most sensible thing to do was to learn to read well. So in a country where we weren't really allowed to be, I decided to be, to get water from the stones, you see. After I met my beautiful wife, although beauty was the least of her, strong and fearless was the most of her. Well, she taught me lots of things. Big thing, best thing she taught me was to learn to write the words too. Taught me I wasn't just a second-rate man raised on white flour and Christianity. It was my wife, Elsie, who brought me the first dictionary. I think she knew she was planting a seed, germinating something inside me when she did that. What a companion the dictionary is. There are stories in that book that'll knock your boots off. To this day, it remains my prized possession, and I wouldn't trade it for all the tea in China. The dictionary from Elsie is why I'm writing it down. It was my introduction to the idea of recording. written just like the Reverend once wrote births and baptisms at the mission, like the station manager wrote rations at the station, and just like the ma'ams and masters wrote our good behaviour at the boys' home. A list of words any fool can look up and be told the meaning. A dictionary, even if this language isn't mine alone, even if it's something we grow into and then living long enough shrink away from. I am writing because the spirits are urging me to remember, because the town needs to know that I remember. They need to know now more than ever before to begin. But there are too many beginnings for us Gondiwindi. That's what we were bestowed and cursed with by the same shifty magic and eternal once upon a time. The story goes that the church brought time to us, and the church, if you let it, will take it away. I'm writing about the other time though, deep time. This is a big, big story. The big stuff goes forever. Time ropes and loops and is never straight. That's the real story of time. The problem now facing my own once upon a time is that Dr. Shah from the High Street surgery has recently given me a filthy bill of health, cancer of the pancreas, which is me done and dusted. So because they say it is urgent, because I've got the church time against me, I'm taking pen to paper to pass on everything that was ever remembered, all the words I found on the wind. Yarran tree, spearwood tree, or hickory acacia. Yarrani. The dictionary is not just words. There are little stories in those pages too. After years with the second great book, I figured out the best way to read it. First time I went in like reading the Bible, front to back, AA words first. There you find Aaron and him in the book of Exodus, brother of Moses, founder of Jewish priesthood. Aardvark, that animal with the tube nose that eats the ants of Africa. There are abbreviations too, like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, where people go to heal from the bottle. That punched me in the guts. My mummy, she said, the Aborigine is a pity, my son. She said everyone was always insulted by her no matter what she did, so she let herself do the most insulting thing she could think of, take the poison they brought with them and go to town. You could keep reading the dictionary that way, front to back, straight as a dart, or you could get to aardvark and then skip to Africa, and then skip to continent, then skip to nations, and then skip to colonialism, and then skip over to empire, and skip back to apartheid in the A section that happened in South Africa, another story. When I was on the letter W in the Oxford English Dictionary, wire would be in that section. It means no. Wire wasn't there though, but I thought I'd make it there. Wheat was there, but when I skipped ahead, not our word for wheat, not yura. So I thought I'd make my own list of words. We don't have a Z word in our alphabet, I reckon, so I thought I'd start backwards, a nod to the backwards whitefella world I grow up in. Start at Y, Yarrani. So that is the once upon a time for you. Say it, Yarrani. It is our word for spearwood tree, and from it I once made a spear in order to kill a man.
Thank you so much. And maybe now what I said early on, that there's a musicality in her writing, now makes sense to you. Because there's a particular energy that derives from that. Is that important for you as a writer while writing, to read out loud? And does that maybe comes from proverbs or oral tradition?
Yeah, I think because I didn't study literature, and because and I dropped out of high school, and so my early relationship with books was very naive, and I was always attracted to song in the way that song could tell a story in terms of lyrics, and poetry, how poetry could be so succinct with an idea or an emotion. And so I think that was sort of my informal background to entering the publishing world. This first book that I wrote was the first short story I'd ever written, and my editor could see that there was this, I think, uneducated way of using language, which was incorrect. I was using English in a really incorrect way, idiosyncratic way. I was juxtaposing in the wrong manner. My grammar was all over the place, but my editor sort of, and I'm so thankful for that in a sense, because it was almost a nod of approval that it was okay, even though I read my first novel and I think it's terrible because I've learnt now the rules of language. But it allowed me, so she kind of ushered that in and allowed me then to have a style which I think is that influence of poetry and music and song, and that I want to, and you're right about the reading it aloud. The editing process for me is constantly reading aloud until it can almost sing on the page for me. Yeah.
Maybe it's connected to you learning Wiradjuri language?
Maybe, but also in my family, you know, my father was also a really good storyteller. He knew, and not a reader at all. He was a really good oral storyteller. We had a fire pit in our garden, and our whole childhood was spent in the bush, hearing stories, and knew where to, just naturally knew where to put the punchline, and the significance on the sort of climax of a story. So I think it's a number of, there's a number of things. I mean, it's not for everyone. There's a lot of 1-star reviews on Goodreads, but it's just the way I do it. I think also in the editing process too, I find that when I can read something aloud and have the patience to read it aloud after it's been edited, it signifies to me that it's okay writing. But I think and I don't know if you as a writer have experienced this as well, Charlotte, sometimes when you're going through your book in that editing process, you skip through. There's a sort of skimming of passages, and I think that's a reluctance to really read them because you know that they're not singing on the page. No? So when I start to skim some of my passages, I know I got to go back. Yeah.
You just told us how your father told you stories. He was a storyteller. You wrote this novel mostly in Europe and
Right.
France. So you were approaching home from afar. Was there such thing as rediscovering home for you?
Yeah, and I think that, of course, it can be, there's two sides to, there's the pros and cons of writing from a distance. But, I mean, the whole idea of the writer's residency, to leave home and to have that solitude, and it works, for some people, is based on that idea of having the distance in order to have perspective. I think for me, because most of the book has been written from a distance, except for maybe 12 times coming back to Nuremberg, coming back to country to reacquaint myself with the geography of the landscape and the memory and the history at various periods over a decade. But having that perspective means that you're not completely overwhelmed by the senses and almost overwhelmed in the way that it could be distracting. And then what also I found happens is the things that actually make it onto the page are the moments that really burnt you, whether it's a smell or, the way the light's moving there in Australia on the bush or on the ocean. You're dealing with the most, poignant memories. That's all you have at your desk. So I feel like there's more of there can be more of an emotion involved. But of course then there's the difficult side where I would have to ring people to tell me, to try and explain what this particular flower or plant smelled like, that I could never find if I walked out the door in France. There's no Australia to be found in the forest there or the city. So, and then also using the use of technology in terms of the Wiradjuri language had been recorded and digitally archived, not in this format, but in a basic dictionary format. And going on YouTube and watching, amateur bird watchers that would post these 4 or 5 hour long home recordings of nothing happening, but I could sit and I could hear the sound of the bush that I knew what the sound of the bush was. I knew that there was a whip and there was something significant to it, but I'd lost how to describe it to its pinpoint. And so the use of, who would have thought bird watch, 4 or 5 hour long videos on YouTube with nothing's happening, but feeling the audio immersion of a place. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Let's talk about August for a minute, or maybe August and Puppy, about both of them. She returns with feelings of shame and guilt for leaving, and she hasn't really found out who she is, and she carries a deep sadness inside of her. Throughout the novel, we discover why. But next to the discovery, there's a process of healing for both Poppy and August. In his dictionary, Poppy says, "Claim that space where shame lived, where things were lost, where we were kept away from our culture." And he also says, he came a long way to be proud of his culture again. How does he manage that? And how much is this healing process connected to telling your own story?
Right. I think the significance of the fact that a system of governance was based on the complete oppression of a people, the incarceration of a people, and the enslavement of the people. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and Pacific Islanders were in a form of slavery where they weren't paid wages. They were... They could have dog tags to leave a certain property, but mostly not. There was the Masters and Slaves Act in Australia, which treated Indigenous people, particularly men, as property. Aboriginal people were considered flora and fauna, were considered plant until very recently. My father wasn't given the vote until I was 1. So then you've got the removal of homelands, the destruction through pastoral activity of homelands, the suppression of culture, and like many colonising countries, colonisers, the direct attack of an Indigenous language in the process of colonisation, which is to suppress it, outlaw it, and to also associate it with a sort of savagery and almost a stupidity, a dirtiness. So then you've also got the White Australia policy in 1901. You've got the removal of children, which was an entire generation called the Stolen Generations, right up until the 1970s. I'm saying all this, prefacing all this, and then you've got contemporary attitudes. The 90s, when I grew up, was this sort of era of outright and vocal hatred in Australia of the other, whether that be migrants, but particularly always Indigenous people. And then we see our global society now with the rise of right-wing ideas and fascism. So through all this oppression and suppression of a people, a word entered the Indigenous vernacular, and that word is shame. It was a shame to have been removed from your family, to not know who your homeland is. Removed because of your indigeneity, but then have no cultural linkage to that. As I said with my father, shame has been the dark cloud over Aboriginal people for centuries. So shame as a thread through this book, it was really important for me not to have a book of good and evil, but to address sort of language that was imposed on Indigenous people through coercion and through his history. So I wanted it to move from the language of victimhood to victory. And so the characters themselves, through this decolonizing of the tongue, particularly the tongue and the throat and the mind, get to have the word, Indigenous word, attached to shame and be rid of it. Does that make sense? And to overcome it. And we talk about, you mentioned August, who's another of narrators. So there's 3 narrators to this book. There's Poppy, who I've read, whose narrative voice is first person, written in the form of a dictionary. And then there's August, his granddaughter, who's come back at the beginning of the novel for his memorial, for his funeral, her grandfather's funeral. And she's kind of propelling the action through the novel, the contemporary action, on this 500 acres of land. But she has, I think you said, a depression, a sadness, and it's shame. But it's also associated with food. So in the Wiradjuri language, actually, there's a word for her sort of psychosis that she's carried from childhood, and it's called nyaran. And it means to be hungry and weak and depressed at once. And hungry in the way that even to not be sated, even emotionally or spiritually, that English could not satiate her need to express something, and hungry for a connection to country. She has a significant edible relationship with the land that is a trauma-based relationship. So it sort of shows Nyaran also shows the complexity of one language to explain this idea that English could not, because it's not simply a depression, it's not simply a grief, it's weak and hungry and depressed at once. I think I went through Nyaran as I wrote this book as well. It's well publicised, that I gained 35 kilograms in the last 2 years of writing the book. And I think that for me that because of the historical archives that I had to go through to write this book, to sort of take on this burden and turn it into something that's a novel, a story, where you have characters to root for and, action to propel you through a journey, sort of quest, to look at it, these historical documents and archive of genocide and torture and ancestors shackled from the neck. To do all that was a trauma for me. And I think my physical body took on that. Yeah, I need to go to the gym soon, because it's done now. But yeah, I had Nyaran too. And then the third narrator is the Reverend Greenleaf, which makes being in Berlin quite significant tonight.
Because he's a German who opened a mission in 1880. He's writing a letter from internment describing the violence indigenous people received. And while reading, I assumed he must represent like the white gaze because he discovers indigenous people and indigenous language, and he also discovers racism for him as a white person. Is he like a self-proclaimed good white person who does harm either way, or is he more like a, and is he in this way an identification figure for white readers maybe?
I think, and that's all the narrators, don't worry, that's as complex as it gets. I think for the Reverend, who was based on a real life missionary, but I changed obviously the story and the fact that I made him a Lutheran in order to go full circle within the novel. I'll try not to do spoilers, but I don't think it's, I think it's okay. So I needed, he is, as many missionaries were altruistic and idealistic and had a sense of the white saviour, that he was helping, even though through missions they suppressed language and culture and, divided families. He felt that he was helping the Indigenous, the Aboriginal, by protecting them from the violence of settlers and pastoralists and police. So, but at the same time, he also oppressed them and suppressed that cultural link. So I didn't want to have a clean villain because we are contradictory, and our history, has so often been excused that, but it was done, the removal of children, for instance, was done under the best intentions for the sort of propaganda of protection, the same way we do with asylum seekers in incarcerating them under the propaganda of protecting them. It was done with the protection of specifically children. So he needed to be complex on the page, and I needed the reader to work out whether he was good or bad, because I don't think it was black and white. I needed him to have a sense of what he had done by making him a Lutheran and having him undergo the persecution on the basis of the place of his birth during World War I, which where the anti-German sentiment grew, and German communities, particularly in South Australia, where Prussians and Germans had been the first wine producers, had undergone, where schools were burnt down, German businesses were razed, the language was outlawed, there were sort of propaganda in the streets that said, do your bit, kill a German. And of course, many were interned and died in internment within Australia. It's almost like Australians have an amnesia about so many ruptures within their history, but that was a significant one. So only through his own persecution of his mother tongue could he have the perspective that I needed for the novel. And, I treat, Poppy has this relationship with religion. And, in many Indigenous communities, Christianity has been both a horror and a healer, in a sense. And many especially North Queensland Aboriginal communities, straddle those two worlds, their indigeneity and have a relationship with Christianity. So I wanted to almost be respectful of the essence of that religion, and how, for Poppy in particular, the stories of the Bible were all he had in his, forced instruction. The good that he could find out of them were a grace in his life, in an environment at the boys' home particularly, where he was beaten and dealt punishments and removed from family. So it's complex for Poppy also, and complex for those that have this terrible inheritance, and how the grandchildren, the children and grandchildren, view the imposing religion on their people and their ancestors. Does that make sense?
But
Yes.
the missionary plays another role, maybe not
Right.
he in particular, but missionaries in general, because while you already told us that they try to tone down the indigenous languages, they recorded it too,
Yeah.
and it was later used to reclaim the indigenous languages. So how does that affected your own this story? But how did it affect Poppy in the book?
Yeah, when I did the research into the reclamation of Wiradjuri and other languages, as a bit of a background on at the point of colonisation, there was about 800 sub-dialects of 250 Indigenous languages within Australia, and at the moment there are, through the work of reclamation and preservation, there are 60 active written and spoken languages, which Wiradjuri is one of them. But in many instances, in the process of reclaiming a language and building a language back up, because it is a living thing, a language, it changes, it's able to be adapted and built on with new information. So if I look at Wiradjuri, for instance, records were used from police sergeants, pastoralists, and missionaries, records that they'd just kept out of a sort of curiosity, I think. And in some ways, there was a friendship in some instances with the local people. Yeah, so for instance, the missionary that this is based on kept a list of, and many of them were incorrect, but they helped elders to look through and rebuild the words, kept a list of 115 terms, words in Wiradjuri. So yeah, it's as I said, it's complex. Those that had significantly, suppressed a people had also played a part in, many decades later in the healing, in a sense, of a people, because it is a healing thing to reclaim this language. It's used significantly in rehabilitation for trauma and for drug and alcohol rehabilitation. Yeah.
If you have any questions in the audience, please raise your hand. I will ask you another question, and when I see through the lights where hands are lifted, please just tell us what you want to know. We don't have a microphone for you because of COVID, but we will hear you. In the beginning, I said that you initiated the Share Your Mic Now Australia campaign to amplify Indigenous voices. Can you tell us how it worked and what impact it had?
some of our media and sort of celebrities and politicians, as the Black Lives Matter exploded in the US after the murder of George Floyd, there was a reaction in Australia where Indigenous people, and many have died by police brutality and incarceration, had a historical, visceral, reaction to this event. And there was a real dismissal, as I said, from celebrities and media and from politicians that Black Lives Matter didn't matter in Australia. It wasn't, I do lose my English words, wasn't valid in Australia. When we've had the inquiry in 1991 into Aboriginal deaths in custody, there's a long history, obviously, of police violence against Indigenous people, violence for using and being arrested for actually speaking language in the streets, and so on. And so, of course, there's this amnesia in Australia that I think Indigenous people are always up against, to once and for all have a sort of have an acceptable overarching truth-telling and belief in a real history that happened. Even in my schooling, we weren't taught that. We were taught about terra nullius. We were taught that it was a peaceful acquisition of Australia by the First Fleet, by Britain. We were taught of this idea of the Indigenous person as a noble savage who was weak and beneath the norm of whiteness in Australia. So when this all happened, I mean, it's been going on forever and we've written about it forever, but it was the mainstream voice that was shutting it down. Even from that distance, it was awful, it was disgusting. And I couldn't hear a sane Indigenous voice. It wasn't platformed in the media or on social media, which is, today's media. And so Share the Mic Now was borrowed from the US, but because of my white privilege as an Indigenous person, because of the colour of my skin, I didn't feel I could be in a position to speak, in a sense. And so it was about amplifying Indigenous voices into the conversation. So social media accounts of celebrities and white media were taken over and it's ongoing by Indigenous scholars and activists and young people to sort of set the record straight and sort of breaking that echo chamber within Australia where there's, the liberal sort of educated side of Australia that are open and read books like this and are aware of our history up against the overarching voice, which is to dismiss. So reaching that audience where it was a complete obvious sort of whitewashing of our history. Once again, it's incredible that it's happening, in 2020. So yeah, that's what it is. That's what's happening in Australia now. But there needs to be, and I think that's why I wrote the book and focused so highly on language, because I could really see, and it's for my father, it really was the impetus to push through, was because of his trauma and as a sort of a gift of healing for him as much as it is for my child. Language is so significant. It's this this invisible violence that happened that I needed to explore, and sort of how significant it was in the triangulation of culture, the connection to country and to family and kin and knowledge. There's this Gugiwa Tiongo quote that I always had above my desk when I wrote this. And he wrote, the Kenyan writer, who, he said that the bullet was the means of the physical subjugation and language was the means of the spiritual subjugation. And those of us that know of the physical subjugation of the war and the incarceration, but that spiritual subjugation was just as a significance of violence that I needed to explore. Yeah, and in terms of share the mic, in terms of this, how that works now is to challenge that dominant voice that wants to keep Australia in a sort of amnesia of its foundation. Yeah.
Does anyone has a question for Tara June Winch? Yeah, so maybe we start here.
I started writing when I dropped out of school, really. I started writing long letters and, fumbling attempts at poetry, as we all do in our teens. Letter writing, and that's still something that, as I said, has got me through the pandemic, is to return to that first-person internal voice. I was self-taught, which is, I wish I'd studied writing, to be honest. But that's what was so interesting about the relationship with Wole Soyinka, is because he's a Nobel laureate, he's a great professor of literature as well, but he was able to he had like a clean slate to work with in terms of how he was going to educate me in literature, by, introducing me to Greek myths, to the Bible stories, to Yoruba culture as well, and how the mythologies and even the idea of the chi spirit, but how our histories and culture intertwined and overlapped. So, it's been such a strange educational journey, and the writing came from letter writing, and the first short story that I wrote became the first chapter in my book. So really naive and almost serendipitous in its arrival into bookstores. So the whole book was written with music in the background. I listened to a lot of Indigenous musicians like Dr. G and Archie Roach that I grew up on, because there's such a storytelling quality to the music. Dr. G sang in Yolngu, Matha, Indigenous language, but you can almost through that, it's like Germans listening to English pop songs. You can still feel the emotion, you can still feel the essence of the song. So, home musicians, and then, folk music as well. France, I came to France because I did, through my teens, come across French writers like Albert Camus and Marguerite Duras, and I was definitely influenced by their writing, that I felt that they could, in such a short, sort of compact sentence or paragraph or image, they could explain so much. There's almost a poetic way to the way Duras and Camus wrote, and also the depth of their writing, that it was philosophical, it was about, there was an enormity in such simple words or simple sentence structures. So I went to France initially with a romantic notion of French writers and wanting to be immersed in, I don't know, like the 1920s idea of Paris, and then stayed, because my husband's French. So, like I said, that it was working on multiple levels, as a handbook, a weapon to claim native title, and in that way to show a civilization. He's also a time traveller, and sort of almost, it's a magical realist narrative, because the idea of the dreaming is that time exists in, all time exists in the present. And so the challenge was, how could a lay person, Poppy, tell the story of all time, particularly his Indigenous culture, when he had himself been removed from it. So when his ancestors come to visit him, and the river of his childhood appears before him in front of the boy's home, and he goes on sort of this dreaming it is, where his ancestors, his great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers there, taking him to a dance, and teaching him about the use of fire and cooking techniques. And in that way, that's where a significant amount of the years were spent on research to find these practices that Wiradjuri people undertook, and to find the evidence in museums and studies, and to weave it into a dreaming. He's telling the significance of his civilization. So he needed to go all the way back, and in that process of going all the way back, now his grandchildren can use that information to go all the way forward. So in that way, I hope the reader can understand that it covers all time. That was my intention.
Thank you. With the timetable in mind, I already got a sign that I should finish this event. We come to an end. The audience, you have now the chance to get a signed copy of the book outside. Tara will wait for you. Before that, I want to thank you for listening to us, and of course, I want to thank you for talking to me. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it was great meeting you and talking to you. Thank you. This applause is for you, and to everyone, a good evening.
Thanks, Charlotte.